Many Canadians are concerned about the long-term effects this pandemic is having on our economy. From small business closing to pandemic relief efforts like CERB, how will we recover? To help us understand what is really going on, we're joined by Ray Pennings, Executive Vice President of Cardus. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ray.
Thank you for having me.
So, Ray, will generations to come be paying for this, all of this that we're enduring when it comes to our economy?
Well, certainly there's a price to be paid, and the price is not just dollars and cents, but it certainly is that. We've obviously had record levels of government support and stimulus. That will, obviously, with low interest rates as they are and projected for a while, the actual government indebtedness currently is not that significantly different than it might have been in the mid-90s. So we came through that. Economically, there are paths forward that one can see. I think the bigger challenge is going to be in individual lives, people who work in particular sectors that are not going to recover, other people who are working and impacted by economic transitions that will significantly impact their lives. So it will have lifelong impacts for many Canadians, to be sure.
Close to $80 billion paid out in the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB, last year. Many Canadians who benefited from CERB are now heading into an intimidating tax season. Did the government handle this well or wrong?
It's easy with 2020 hindsight to blame government, and I want to be careful in terms of that. It was a very quickly delivered program. At the time, I suggested that perhaps using the tax system rather than the separate application process might have been a little easier along the way. One of the downsides of the way they chose is there were no withholdings at source, which means that people are now going to have to declare, in many cases, $16,000 on their tax bill. That they haven't had anything withdrawn from, and a lot of people aren't used to making that sort of tax planning decisions. The government has, in the last few weeks, attempted to change some of the rules retroactively. That will lead to a sense of unfairness. On the one hand, they're showing compassion for those who applied but might not have been able. On the other hand, there's lots of people who read the rules and did not apply and are going to have a sense of unfairness about $16,000 that their neighbors got that they didn't get. So you can look, there's a lot of mess to be cleaned up as a result of CERB.
So, Ray, in a recent article you wrote, COVID-19 has opened the eyes of many to the need of real change that seemed impossible before the, quote, great pause of the pandemic. Can you explain that?
Well, I think there's several things. I think most of us assumed that sort of the rat race of life in which we had our lives fully scheduled was the only way, and we felt helpless in saying no to things. And then all of a sudden, the pandemic said no for us, and we spent time with families. We spent time having meals together. We spent time playing board games. A lot of things happened that all of a sudden forced us to reassess our sense of priorities in terms of what was important. And I'm hoping that some of those lessons are more deeply felt and considered, and that we won't just go back to the way things were before. Obviously, none of us are looking for a continued lockdown, and there were a lot of things that were lost that were pretty important too. But certainly, I think it forced most Canadians to have a reassessment of priorities, and I think that ultimately was a very good thing.
Yeah, and as we talk about lessons learned as Christians, what perspective should we be taking when we look at all of this that's been happening?
I think there's always three things that have jumped to mind as I've reflected over the last 11 months on this. First of all, the fact is that in God's providence, we are to take the rain as well as the sunshine. They all have a purpose in God's plans, and we need to be humble in that regard and not have a sense of entitlement. I think it was very easy to live as if we were entitled to sort of the middle-class North American Western life with all of the goodies that we had, and that certainly is not the case. I think the second thing that I would highlight is God speaks. He speaks through Scripture to us, but he also speaks through general revelation, through the happenings of providence. And I think we need to have our voice, especially our ears, especially as a Western society that has attempted to live very much with a trust in science, a trust in self, a trust in autonomy. I think we need to listen to the very powerful voice of God. in the midst of it and be attentive to that. Which brings us to the third thing, and that is there has been a hubris about our culture and our confidence in science. And on the one hand, we can take a look at the remarkable speed with which the vaccine has been put together and all the rest. On the other hand, even in delivering it, we're seeing an element of humility that it doesn't all quite work out the way it is. And I think, when all the forces of the economy of Western democracy are all brought to a stop, then I think we, with Paul of old, have to say, "You are the potter, we are the clay. You're in charge. Your ways are higher than our ways."
All right, Ray Pennings from Cardus, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.